everybody, and welcome to our channel again. Today with me there is Andy Rothman, and he's an investment strategist from Matthews Asia. Welcome, Andy.
Great to be here, thanks.
Andy, in your last report about Chinese equity, you wrote that in the current crisis, China has developed as something like a safe haven for investors. So this is sounds very provocative. So yeah, please explain it to.
Sure. The thesis goes that China got the virus first. It originated there, the scientists believe, and they now seem to have brought it significantly under control. And at the same time, they seem to have taken enough steps to put a safety net under their small and medium-sized privately run companies that drive growth there. And the two of these things lead me to believe that we're likely to see an economic recovery in China earlier than in most of the rest of the world. And we're also likely to see a more accelerated recovery because I think the government there has done a good job to allow small companies to hang on until the virus has been defeated and they can open their doors again. So things won't get back to normal quickly, but they're moving steadily in the right direction.
So we can see this interesting graph about optimism in China. So are the Chinese in general more optimistic people, or what is the reason behind it?
I don't know if they're generally more optimistic, but I think that most people in China remember the Chinese government's response to the global financial crisis 10 years ago. It was swift and huge in scale and effective. And so even though the government hasn't done all that much yet in China, most people there seem to believe that if a very large stimulus is necessary, their government's going to be able to roll it out quickly and efficiently again.
Currently, I think the biggest fear is for China to re-import the virus again. So we could read that the borders are locked down for foreigners again. So what is the danger for the Chinese economy coming from that?
Actually, I think that the two most important risks in China are the same risks that we're facing in Germany and in the United States and everywhere else. The biggest risk, the first one, is that after the virus is suppressed, it comes back again. Because it might be lurking out in the community, or because we go back to leading our normal lives and we get a second wave of the virus. Now, we can study China to learn a lot about that, because over the last few weeks, people have been going back to work, going back to offices and socializing again, riding public transit, and there hasn't been a big second wave, a big resurgence. The virus has stayed calm, and as you noted, 98% of the new cases in China recently, and there's only been about 30 or 40 a day, but 98% of those have been people coming back with the virus from overseas, mostly Chinese people. I think right now, mostly Chinese students who are coming back from abroad. So they're going to have to be really careful with surveillance, with testing to track that down, just like we're going to have to do that in our countries once we get the virus under control. The second big risk in China and in our countries as well is, have they done enough to provide a safety net for the small privately run businesses, the mom and pop shops that drive the Chinese economy just like our economies, so that once the virus is suppressed, they have the ability to pay workers, pay their rent, restock inventory, and take advantage of business coming back. So those are the two things that I'm watching.
That leads me to the next question. So Chinese government, they really held back with fiscal measures so far. So in comparison to those measures in the US or in Europe, or latest in Japan. So what can we expect here from the Chinese government?
You're right. The Chinese government has not taken the really dramatic steps that most other governments and central banks have taken yet. They seem to believe that they've done enough to support small businesses. For example, a while back, they suspended collecting a lot of taxes and fees from companies. They put pressure on landlords to defer collecting rent. They've told banks to be lenient on loan and mortgage payments. They don't seem to feel that they need to come out with the big guns yet. And I think that's probably for a couple of reasons. One is that the Chinese economy is growing much more rapidly than almost every other country's GDP growth in the world, which gives them more cushion for the slowdown. Second, they seem to believe that they've done enough to put a floor under things and without a big fiscal stimulus. And third, they don't seem to be worried right now about unemployment getting to double digits like we're seeing in the United States, which could lead to social stability problems, which would lead them to bring out the big stimulus guns. But I think if the situation changes and things slow down more than I expect, then you would see them bring out the big fiscal guns.
Currently, nobody is talking about the trade conflict between the US and China anymore. So is this something we have to deal with it until the next election in the US? Is this some kind of uncertainty that will stay there?
It is an uncertainty that's going to remain at least for a while, because when we listen to people in the Trump administration, although not the president himself, we hear a lot of rhetoric about competition between the United States and China, and a perception often that China is a force for bad in the global economy. But let's put this in perspective. From the Chinese perspective, they are not an export-led economy. And very few other countries seem to be wanting to join the US bandwagon on tariffs and creating a potential trade war with China. Last year, only 18% of total Chinese exports went to the United States. Also, China is no longer an export-led economy. Over the last 5 years, on average, for example, net exports, the value of a country's exports minus their imports, contributed roughly zero to China's GDP growth. So an impact of a trade war would not be zero, but I think it would be much more modest than most people believe. But I think we do need to be wary of the fact that relations between Washington and Beijing on the political level are pretty bad right now.
As it seems, as we are coming to an end of the virus crisis in China, so this is not something we have seen in the US. So they were still far away from the peak there. What pressure is coming from that for the Chinese economy, and especially what pressure is it putting on stock prices in China?
Well, I would say that the Chinese virus situation is moving in the right direction, but it's probably premature to say they have it completely under control or it's over. They need to be vigilant. We all need to be vigilant about this. It is clearly having pressure in the Chinese economy. In the first 2 months of this year, January and February, the economic data was grim. For example, retail sales growth in fixed asset investment were both down by almost 25% year over year. But we have seen a lot of data, both published by the government and collected privately, and from talking to companies on an individual basis, that the economy is coming back. So I would guess that overall, economic activity in China now is back to somewhere between 70 to 80% of normal. It's not likely to get to normal anytime soon, but that's a really positive thing, given that it's only about 76 days after the complete lockdown of Wuhan on January 23rd, as we're speaking today. So that gives me hope that if we in the US and Germany and the rest of Europe are able to bring the virus under control and continue to test and surveil adequately, that our economies can recover as well. But I think the recovery in China is going to be earlier, which is why I wouldn't advocate an opportunistic bet in China, but I think it's good for investors to think about how much exposure they have to China, when China by itself every year on average accounts for about 1/3 of global economic growth. That's a larger share of global growth than from the US, Europe, and Japan combined. And so this is a good opportunity to think about whether investors have an adequate exposure to that driver of global growth.
Which will be the industries recovering first in China from the virus crisis?
Well, it's easier to talk about industries that are going to lag behind. And I think that's going to include anything that requires consumers to gather in a confined space. So I would expect it's going to be harder for restaurants and hotels and entertainment related sectors to recover. We also have to be wary about the continuing tariff disputes. So exporters are going to be hard hit, especially if there's a global recession. But as I mentioned earlier, that impact on the overall economy will be modest. So where I would focus would be on Chinese companies selling goods and services to Chinese consumers. And that domestic demand part of the economy is the biggest part. Last year was the 8th consecutive year in which the consumer and services part of the economy was biggest part, bigger than manufacturing and construction. And last year, almost 60% of growth came from consumption. So that's what I would be focusing on, is China's domestic demand story.
What long-term effects will the coronavirus have on the Chinese economy?
That's a great question, and a question that we can ask about every other economy as well. And I think it's probably too soon to know, because it's too soon to really understand how long the virus is going to be with us, whether we'll be able to get a vaccine, whether it will disappear like the SARS outbreak in 2003. So I don't even want to speculate on that at this point.
So this was Andy Rothman, investment strategist from Matthews Asia. Thank you very much for the interview, Andy.
Thanks. Great to be with you.